Right. Yeah. So, all right. So, hello everyone. Today we'll be having our second seminar of the year, in which we will take a look at several historical sources and discuss them in relation to the causes of Japanese expansion. Firstly, we went over the origins of Japanese nationalism and expansionism when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan, determined to trade, him being the country's first contact with the West. Moreover, we looked at how Japan's desire for expanding determined their victory over the First Sino-Japanese War and consequently their control over most of Asia. Secondly, we looked at how Japan ended their isolationist foreign policy when they signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902, thus boosting Japanese confidence and determining their first recognition by the West. Thirdly, we briefly discussed the Russo-Japanese War, through which Japan came out victorious, proving their Western assimilation and both their military and expansionist capability of defeating their first European power.
Yeah, so after that, Japan, after beating the Russians and the Chinese, they acquired new territories. For example, Korea when they beat the Chinese, and the Liaodong Peninsula from when they beat the Russians. On the First World War, Japan saw an opportunity to enlarge their empire, and they beat Germany on the Shandong Islands on the South Pacific Ocean. And after that, Japan started to be a little more diplomatic and is started being more involved in what's happening in the world. And a proof of this was the Washington Conference, in which Japan signed three different agreements. So, as we said, at first we looked at Perry's intervention in Japan. And what do you think is the relationship between this visit from Commodore Matthew Perry with the Sino-Japanese War? Would anyone like to contribute? Mariano, can you call them? I cannot see the hands.
Well, would anyone like to participate for the first question of the seminar? Luis Santiago, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do, especially because the contact with the West empires unraveled the Meiji Restoration and the Treaty of Kanagawa with the US, and the government became aware of the Western empires and hesitant to build one of their own. I think that the Meiji Restoration helped a lot in the Meiji Restoration and the military being modernized and the people being nationalists made a source B states a better military that could defeat the Sino-Japanese, the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War.
Perfect. Does anyone else want to contribute to this question? Okay, well, moving on.
Okay, so in reference to source A, pardon me. In reference to source A, how does Ubakata Toshiro reflect Japan's strong nationalistic and expansionist origins? Daniela Flores, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, so in reference to source C, the origins of nationalism and expansionism are clear stated. So we can see that when Toshiro said the excitement of Japanese people was beyond imagination, so we can see that this helped Japanese with their nationalism because people became more like aware of the situation and they wanted to maintain Japan in the power. So they provided whatever they could to become a larger power since they had just defeated China and later on they will become a global power.
All right, thank you. Camila.
Yes, as we can see in source A, Japan was very proud and confident due to the fact that they had won a war against China with so little effort, according to the source. China at the moment had a good leader and was much bigger than Japan. Other countries such as Germany, Russia, and France began to notice and pay close attention to Japan's move. Something we have learned throughout history is that countries do not like to have this power, which can only mean that Japan would have to be careful if they wanted to keep growing. Something they could do to achieve this was by following an expansionist foreign policy, which only means one thing: power.
Okay, thank you, Camila. Ana Franco.
I think that the most significatory sentence in source A that speaks to me more about the nationalism in Japan is the first sentence that says that everybody agreed that it would be very difficult to capture Pyongyang. I think that the fact that the Japanese were able to defeat the Koreans and that everyone thought it would be very difficult definitely contributed to this national pride, and moreover this sense of accomplishment. And yeah, I think that I think that that sentence clearly represents how everyone thought that it would have been impossible to conquer Korea, and yet they did. So that gave a lot of nationalist pride to the people in Japan.
Thank you, Ana. Juliana, go ahead.
Well, following what Camila had said, that the Japanese were really excited about having defeated such a big power as China that had good leaders and everything. I also think that part of the reason why it was so important defeating the Chinese and taking what Anna said about the first sentence, I want to concentrate on the part that says that held huge British cannons. Let's remember that according to the textbook, China had become this semi-colonial kind of place, and a semi-colonial kind of place, and the Chinese were had British advisors, right? So I also want to connect that to source B, where not only Chinese officials are bowing down to Japan, but also Western officials. So by conquering a part of China that had Western advisors and was under like British control, the Japanese also kind of bring themselves a little higher up, a little closer to being more like the Western powers, to having colonies and to being a powerful modern nation.
Thank you. So moving on, as Julie said, now we want to mention and reference a little bit of source B. We already did something related to this in homework, but after looking at what source B implies about Japan and China, what does this source and what does the Sino-Japanese War meant in the shifting of balance of power? Monse?
Go ahead.
Well, I think this really represents the Japan's reason for following an expansionist movement. It was not only for money or territory, as many may think, it was way beyond that. They wanted to become a power, and not any type of power, but a Western power, and equals with the leaders of the world. And to be their equals, they had to leave behind what Japan was and westernize themselves, which led to many social and economical controversies in Japan. They changed the way they viewed in the world by stopping isolation. They changed their traditions like samurais, the government, and their military, as seen in Source B, where they changed, where Japanese naval officers used not only westernized uniforms, but weapons, and actually using military techniques to gain territory, terrorizing and killing Asian countries from more land and population, and techniques to gain, and even losing themselves by ignoring their own country internal conflicts and suffering in order to get to the level of Western powers. And the saddest part is they never became their equals. Sure, they were seen a great ally and a bad enemy, but they were never disrespected and taken advantage of throughout the years, even after proving their powers. So even though they changed, they were never taken seriously. And the reason for doing all of this never came true. They were never seen as an equal, not because of their lack of power, but because they were Asians. And I think that's the saddest part. For racial matters, they weren't taken seriously.
Thank you. Jose Guillermo, would you like to contribute? Can you mention something about the shifting of balance of power from this war? Please?
First of all, I would like to, I think Monse brings up really good points. And yeah, I'll try to cover a bit of what you asked. I'll first cover my point.
Yeah.
I believe source B is really interesting, and I found a TOK connection in it, and about what Monza said as well. I believe that Japan, trying to become this Western power as well, this Western-like country, is influenced by its values. A TOK prompt and a TOK concept is how our values influence our actions and vice versa. And in this case, Japan is just trying so hard to become this Western-like country. And it's trying really hard, but in the end, it never achieves it, which is something that frustrates a lot of people in Japan. So the thing here is that they have tried really hard and have failed. So this is another thing that impulses furthermore their strive for more territory and their increase in nationalism and militarism. But could you please repeat the question you were asking, Luna? I'm sorry.
Yes, how did the balance of power change?
Uh, what do you mean, like specifically?
So there was the Sino-Japanese War in which Japan was victorious, and there clearly was a shifting of that balance of power.
Yeah, of course. I believe, well, the power obviously shifted to Japan when they won the war. I mean, there is a clear advantage in military wise by Japan, and China, as we can see in source B, is just absolutely powerless. I mean, the officials are surrendering to naval officers, and clearly an official should be above a naval officer's rank. But in this case, they are completely surrendering to them, and also to Japanese naval officials, making them like just seem completely powerless. The shifting in power was Japan was way high up, and China was in the ground.
Thank you. We will move on to mentioning source C.
Okay, so looking at source C, how does this source reflect Japan's determination to transform itself into a Western-like power, and how did this contribute to its desire for expansion? Would anyone like to contribute? So before we move on to second contributions, would anyone else like to contribute? Maybe Isabel Moctezuma, please go ahead.
Yes, according to source C, official Hayashi, he had the desire of copying the Western design of the warships with the purpose of changing the whole military system of Japan. This is just one of the examples of a variety of ways that Japan was affected by the Western culture as well, and I feel like this affected the way that Japan expanded, because I mean it was the whole military system and how it would, I mean, conquer after this, right? Or like expand.
Thank you, Isa. Juliana, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So as Isa just said, partly the drive for expansionism based on the source is that they wanted to employ Western techniques to continue with their imperialist goals. However, I would like to add that the source says that they would be able to put into their place the powers who seek to meddle in her affairs, referring to Japan, and to eventually be able to meddle in their affairs. And so the reason why they want to expand is to be powerful enough to stop Western powers from imposing their will on Japan. And this was sparked by the triple intervention by Germany, Russia, and France when they forced Japan to give up the Liaodong Peninsula. So that's why it was so important to expand and be equal to Western powers, right? To prevent Western powers from messing with Japan, protecting themselves, and also being able to eventually influence European powers as well, to reverse the roles. So yeah, that's my use of the source.
Thank you, Juliana. Luis Santiago, go ahead.
Yeah, completely agree with Juliana. I think that after the gaining of land and then the frustration of giving it up, gave the Japanese people and government a sense of nationalism in a way that they wanted to be better than the Westerners. And although they knew Japan was close to being one, they had to be better so they could be considered an empire by the Westerners and even surpass the Westerners. As source C presents, if new warships are considered necessary, we must at any cost build them. If it need be, our entire military system must be changed, suggesting that the Japanese would go to extreme lengths to desire of the recognized empire, signifying nationalism and militarism. So the triple intervention really stealing the land from Japan, really what created is more militarism, more nationalism inside a country that now isn't just copying and copying the Westerners, but is also frustrated and seeking for either reconciliation with the Westerners or a sense of equity with them, or how this says being better than them and stopping them from messing with the Japanese empire.
All right, thank you, Luis. Ana Camila.
So as for what Luis previously said of like being trying to in a sort of way relate to the Westerners in sort of their military tactics and the techniques that they were developing and they were taking upon of in certain wars, conflicts, whatever they had between Europe or maybe even Japan. And I think it's very interesting that they wanted to imply them in order to probably understand what their next move was going to be. And I think, as Juliana said, it's a move or a way to try and stop them from like something further, like developing in power or, yeah, I think so. I think that's probably it.
Okay, thank you, Ana Camila. All right, so moving on to the next question. Luna, go ahead.
So this is regarding to the Washington Treaty and moving far along to Japan in diplomatic sense. And I would like to ask you, what do you think was the impact of this man right here, Shidehara Kihura, on on global diplomacy, and did he have a positive or negative impact? And also, how do you think that the Washington Treaty was a way to impede Japan's expansionism? Camila?
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to talk about the source V before, and I wanted to connect it with source C. Can I mention it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to agree with what Monse said. She said that Japanese naval officers use not only westernized uniforms, but weapons and actually using military techniques to gain territory. And I think that relates to source C that says they were focused on using Western methods. When the day arrives, Japan will decide its own fate. I think this is also related to Japan follow the expansionist foreign policy because it would help them with the economy. And one thing they wished to achieve was equality with the West, which meant acquiring colonies. As I mentioned, this would provide economic benefits. Also, Japan was concerned they would lose out because European powers charged to dispose of China, and other countries could have political control in